1:33 a.m. Islamabad. The city's power grid had failed in 3 successive rolling blackouts over the preceding 4 hours, a pattern that the U.S. Embassy's security officer had logged in his situation report at 11 p.m. as consistent with either infrastructure stress or deliberate disruption. The embassy had been on its highest internal security posture since 9 p.m. when the first reports of coordinated gunfire near the Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate headquarters on Kahuta had reached the embassy's duty officer through the State Department communications network. The gunfire had been followed by 3 vehicle-borne explosive events near the Pakistani Army's Rawalpindi Corps headquarters between 9:40 and 10:15 p.m. Not a protest, not a security incident that fit any of the embassy's pre-categorized threat profiles. Something that the intelligence community's classified assessment, transmitted to Washington at 11:30 p.m., had described with careful clinical language as a possible organized effort to temporarily disrupt the Pakistani government's command and control architecture. The word temporary carried the weight of a continent. The organizations capable of executing a coordinated disruption of Pakistan's nuclear command architecture in a single operational sequence were not numerous. The scenario had been modeled by the U.S. intelligence community in classified assessment formats for 16 years, with 4 separate adversary profiles assessed as having the intent and partial capability to attempt it. 2 of those profiles were state actors operating through deniable intermediaries. 2 were non-state organizations with demonstrated technical assistance from state-level intelligence services. The commonality across all 4 profiles was the same operational logic. A sufficiently sophisticated actor did not need to penetrate the vault directly. It needed to penetrate the government's ability to respond to a vault approach. The command disruption was not a prerequisite for the vault approach. It was the operation. The vault approach was the pressure instrument that gave the command disruption its strategic utility, creating a window in which the Pakistani government could not coherently authorize its own response, while a force was simultaneously approaching its most sensitive storage facility, was the scenario that 11 years of bilateral protocol maintenance had been designed to address. The word temporary carried the weight of a continent. Pakistan's Nuclear Command Authority operated through a chain that connected the Prime Minister's office to the National Command Authority Secretariat to the Strategic Plans Division, which managed the physical security and operational status of the country's nuclear assets. The chain had 4 links. At 1:33 a.m., 2 of those links were non-functional. The Prime Minister's office had lost secure communications with the NCA Secretariat at 12:44 a.m., a communications failure attributed initially to the power grid instability and subsequently assessed by 1:15 a.m. as a targeted severing of the fiber connection between the 2 facilities. The NCA Secretariat itself was reporting through its backup satellite communications channel that its exterior perimeter had been breached by an unknown force at approximately 1:20 a.m., and that the facility was under active pressure from an element whose composition and organizational affiliation had not yet been established. The Strategic Plans Division facility at Chaklala, which maintained operational oversight of Pakistan's nuclear arsenal, was reporting normal status as of 1:28 a.m., normal status through backup communications channels, with the primary fiber link severed and the facility's own perimeter detection system showing movement in the outer approach zone that the on-duty security commander had classified as probable but unconfirmed contact, and the Kahuta Research Laboratories, the facility that housed the centrifuge cascade infrastructure for Pakistan's highly enriched uranium program, and a storage vault assessed by U.S. intelligence as containing between 12 and 18 nuclear device components in varying states of assembly, had transmitted a distress signal on the emergency Pakistan-U.S. Nuclear Security Coordination Channel at 1:31 a.m. 2 minutes before 1:33, The distress signal had a pre-agreed format, 3 specific code groups in sequence. The code groups meant perimeter under active engagement, external assistance requested, facility security status uncertain. The Pakistan-US Nuclear Security Coordination Channel had existed for 11 years. The distress signal format had been negotiated over 3 rounds of bilateral technical discussions. The protocol for responding to a Kahuta distress signal had been rehearsed in tabletop exercises 4 times. It had never been rehearsed in conditions where the Pakistani government's command authority was simultaneously compromised, where the organizational identity of the force pressing the facility's perimeter was unknown, and where the elapsed time between signal receipt and any possible U.S. response was constrained to under 30 minutes by the proximity of the force to the facility's inner security zone. At 1:33 a.m., all 3 of those conditions were simultaneously present. The distress signal reached U.S. Central Command's Nuclear Security Watch element at 1:33:14 a.m. The watch element transmitted immediately to the National Security Council duty officer, the Secretary of Defense's secure line, and the SECDEF's senior military advisor. The NSC duty officer initiated the emergency notification cascade at 1:33:22 a.m. The President of the United States was notified at 1:34:07 a.m., 45 seconds after the distress signal arrived at CENTCOM. The legal and operational framework for what happened next had been negotiated in secret between the United States and Pakistan beginning in 2007 and formalized in a classified bilateral security agreement signed in 2013. The agreement established a joint US-Pakistan nuclear security response protocol under which U.S. Special Operations Forces pre-positioned at a designated staging location in Pakistan could be activated to assist Pakistani security forces in responding to a Kahuta facility emergency, subject to a request from the Pakistani government or, under a specific emergency clause, subject to a unilateral determination by the U.S. President that the Pakistani government's command authority was temporarily unable to authorize such a request and that the risk to global security warranted immediate action. The emergency clause, 11 years old, never activated. Designed for exactly this scenario, the Pakistani government's command authority was, at 1:33 a.m., partially non-functional. The Prime Minister could not communicate with the NCA Secretariat through primary channels. The NCA Secretariat was under physical pressure. The Strategic Plans Division had not yet received or transmitted an authorization request through its backup channels because it had not yet determined whether an authorization request was warranted. The chain of command that would normally produce a request for U.S. assistance was the same chain of command that the night's events had been specifically designed to disrupt. The President of the United States authorized emergency clause activation at 1:36:44 a.m., 3 minutes and 30 seconds from distress signal to presidential authorization. At 1:36:51 a.m., the activation order reached the Joint Special Operations Command element that had been pre-positioned at Nur Khan Air Base outside Rawalpindi, under the bilateral security agreement's standing protocol. The element had been at the base for 6 days, a rotation that was scheduled and logged as a joint counter-narcotics training exercise. Its actual readiness status was not counter-narcotics training. It had been at 30-minute alert since 9:30 p.m., when the embassy security officer's situation report had reached the JSOC duty officer and triggered a precautionary elevation. 30-minute alert elevated to execute at 1:36:51 a.m. The element's composition had been calibrated specifically to the Kahuta response scenario. 1 assault troop from the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, 1 12-person security element from the Pakistani Special Services Group, who had been co-training with the JSOC element for the preceding 6 days and had been read into the Emergency Activation Protocol, 2 MH-60M Blackhawks from the 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment, and 1 technical specialist team carrying equipment from the Department of Energy's Nuclear Emergency Support Team. The NEST team was not combat personnel. They were the reason the operation existed. The MH-60Ms were airborne at 1:38:14 a.m., 90 seconds from execute order to wheels up. The flight from Nur Khan Air Base to the Kahuta Research Laboratories was 11 kilometers, at low-level tactical airspeed over the Margala Hills foothills. That was approximately 4 minutes of flight time, 4 minutes during which the Kahuta security commander was reporting through his backup satellite channel that the outer perimeter's eastern section had been penetrated by a force he estimated at between 18 and 24 personnel, moving in a pattern consistent with trained tactical movement toward the secondary barrier. The secondary barrier at Kahuta was 340 meters from the storage vault entrance. The force pressing the Kahuta perimeter had been identified through the facility's own thermal imaging system and through a signals intelligence collection that had been running since 1:28 a.m. as a mixed element, not a unified organization. 2 distinct communication patterns operating on different encrypted frequencies with a third communications node that appeared to be providing coordination between the two. The composition suggested not a single actor but a coalition, an unusual operational structure for a facility approach that required precise tactical timing. The U.S. intelligence community's preliminary assessment, transmitted at 1:37 a.m. while the helicopters were still in the air, assessed the force as probably composed of a militant network element providing the manpower and a technically sophisticated external advisory component providing the access and coordination capability. The advisory component's communications pattern had signatures associated with a non-state organization that had been on the CENTCOM watch list for 14 months. The MH-60Ms reached the Kahuta facility at 1:42:17 a.m. The landing zone was a designated emergency access pad inside the facility's inner security perimeter, a location that the 6 days of co-training with the Pakistani SSG element had included in orientation briefings. The SSG personnel on the helicopters had the facility's internal layout, the current position data from the security commander's thermal imaging feeds transmitted via the backup satellite channel, and a pre-planned clearance sequence for the approach routes to the storage vault. The hostile element had breached the secondary barrier at the eastern section at 1:41:33 a.m., 44 seconds before the helicopters landed. The breach placed approximately 12 personnel within the secondary perimeter, at a distance of approximately 340 meters from the storage vault entrance, moving at a pace consistent with methodical tactical advance. The response element moved from the landing pad toward the vault entrance at 1:42:31 a.m., 14 seconds after landing. The NEST team moved with the security element rather than behind it, carrying equipment that required them to reach the vault before the hostile force did. The timeline math was straightforward and uncomfortable. 340 meters for the hostile element moving at tactical pace, 180 meters for the response element moving at maximum covered movement speed from the landing pad to the vault entrance. 2 different distances, similar pace, both measured from approximately the same start time. The response element reached the vault entrance at 1:44:09 a.m. The hostile element reached the vault approach corridor at 1:44:41 a.m., 32 seconds later. The engagement between the response element and the hostile force in the vault approach corridor lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. The corridor's geometry, 3.2 meters wide, 47 meters long, with 2 lateral access points at the 16-meter and 31-meter marks, favored the defending force, which had reached the terminal position first and established coverage of both lateral access points. The hostile element's advance element of 6 personnel entered the corridor at 1:44:41 a.m., and engaged the response element's rearward security position. The response element's SSG personnel held the rearward position while the Delta operators and 2 SSG personnel moved the nest team into the vault entrance and began the technical assessment sequence. The hostile element's remaining 6 personnel attempted to breach the 31-meter lateral access point at 1:45:22 a.m. The attempt was contained. The hostile element attempted a second approach through the 16-meter lateral access at 1:46:08 a.m. with 3 personnel while maintaining pressure on the corridor with the remaining 3. The second attempt was also contained. By 1:47:09 a.m., the hostile element had been rendered non-operational across all 3 approach axes. 3 personnel had evaded back through the secondary perimeter breach and were tracked by the facility's thermal imaging system moving toward the outer perimeter. The 3 evading personnel reached the outer perimeter and exited the facility grounds at 1:49:17 a.m. They were tracked by an MH-60M that had repositioned to a surveillance orbit at 1:43 a.m. The tracking data was transmitted to Pakistani Army units that were establishing a cordon around the facility's outer perimeter. Units that had been activated by the Pakistani military at 1:35 a.m. following emergency notification through the military chain of command that had remained functional when the civilian command chain had been partially disrupted. The 3 evading personnel were apprehended by Pakistani Army units at 1:53:41 a.m., approximately 1.4 kilometers from the facility's eastern perimeter. The nest team's presence in the operation was the element that distinguished it from a conventional security response. The Department of Energy's Nuclear Emergency Support Team maintains a small forward deployable cadre of personnel who specialize in rapid assessment of nuclear material security status, determining within minutes whether a storage environment has been accessed, whether any material has been displaced, and whether any tampering has occurred with the physical security systems that maintain the integrity of nuclear device components in storage. The equipment they carried on the MH-60M was not weapons. It was measurement instruments, portable gamma spectroscopy systems, neutron detectors, and a specialized electronic interrogation device for reading the tamper-evident seals that Pakistani storage protocols required on each device component container. A seal that had been opened and reclosed produced a detectable change in the electronic signature of the seal's verification chip. The system could read 47 seals in under 3 minutes. The Kahuta vault held, according to the pre-coordination inventory documents that the bilateral agreement required Pakistan to maintain, 63 sealed containers across 3 storage categories. Inside the vault, the nest team's technical assessment took 11 minutes and 40 seconds. The assessment used radiation monitoring equipment, physical inspection of the vault's inventory verification system, and a specialized electronic interrogation of the facility's internal tracking system that produced a complete inventory cross-reference in 6 minutes and 20 seconds. The assessment result was transmitted to CENTCOM at 1:58:52 a.m. Vault contents accounted for. Physical security intact. No material accessed or displaced. The distress signal's implication of active engagement had been accurate. The storage vault's contents had not been reached by the hostile element. The 32-second margin between the response element reaching the vault entrance and the hostile element reaching the vault approach corridor had been sufficient. The Pakistani government's command authority began restoring its communications architecture at 2:04 a.m. when emergency repair teams reached the severed fiber connection between the Prime Minister's office and the NCA Secretariat. The Prime Minister's office received its first status report from the Strategic Plans Division at 2:09 a.m. The status report included the information that a US-Pakistani joint response element had activated under the emergency clause of the bilateral security agreement at 1:36 a.m. and had secured the Kahuta vault at 1:44 a.m. approximately 25 minutes before Pakistani conventional military units had established a sufficient perimeter around the facility to prevent further approach by any residual hostile force. The emergency clause activation was the element of the night's events that would require the most careful management in the days and weeks that followed. The bilateral agreement's emergency clause had been drafted with full acknowledgement by both parties that its use would create significant political sensitivity. A U.S. Special Operations Force conducting an active engagement operation inside Pakistan's most sensitive nuclear facility was not an event that could be absorbed into normal bilateral relations without formal diplomatic processing. The processing began at 2:17 a.m. when the U.S. ambassador to Pakistan transmitted a formal notification to the Pakistani Foreign Ministry under the agreement's activation reporting protocol. The notification was the first official communication from the U.S. government to the Pakistani government acknowledging what had occurred at Kahuta in the preceding 44 minutes. The Pakistani government's formal response to the notification took 41 hours. It was delivered in a classified diplomatic channel, not publicly. Its substantive content acknowledged the emergency clause activation as legally consistent with the bilateral agreement, expressed the Pakistani government's appreciation for the outcome, and noted that a formal bilateral review of the night's events would be convened within 60 days under the agreement's post-activation assessment protocol. The response did not use the word gratitude. Diplomatic language at this level of sensitivity rarely did. Time from Kahuta distress signal to presidential authorization: 3 minutes 30 seconds. Time from execute order to wheels up: 90 seconds. Time from distress signal to vault entrance secured: 10 minutes 55 seconds. Hostile force reaching vault approach corridor after vault secured: 32 seconds. Vault contents fully accounted for, no material displacement. Response element and SSG personnel, no fatalities. 2 minor injuries sustained in corridor engagement. Hostile personnel rendered non-operational in facility. 9. Hostile personnel apprehended outside facility. 3. Pakistani civilian command chain restoration, 31 minutes post-distress signal. Diplomatic notification to Pakistan, 44 minutes post-distress signal. Total operational window from distress signal to vault secured: 10 minutes 55 seconds. Bilateral review protocol, activated within 60 days, the 32 seconds. That was the number that the JSOC after-action report returned to repeatedly across its 47 classified pages. The 32-second margin between the response element securing the vault entrance and the hostile force reaching the corridor approach was the product of 4 minutes of flight time, 90 seconds of launch preparation, 3 minutes and 30 seconds of presidential authorization, and the 6 days of code training with Pakistani SSG personnel that had included the facility orientation briefing that made the landing zone selection and the vault approach route possible. Remove any single one of those elements and the 32 seconds became a negative number. The bilateral security agreement's standing protocol, the pre-positioning of a JSOC element at Nur Khan Air Base under a training designation, had been maintained continuously since 2013. 11 years of rotating elements, 6-day training cycles, facility familiarization briefings repeated until they were automatic. 11 years of a protocol that had never been needed. At 1:36:51 a.m., 11 years of maintenance had produced a 90-second launch window and a 32-second margin. The emergency clause had been drafted because both parties understood that the scenario it addressed, a hostile force approaching a nuclear vault during a window when the government's own command chain was disrupted, was precisely the scenario in which advance agreement was the only form of coordination available. There was no time in 32 seconds of margin for negotiation. There was only the protocol that existed, the pre-positioned element that had been maintained, and the decision that had been made in 3 minutes and 30 seconds by a president working from a secure line at 1:34 a.m.